Our next panel, The New Axis of Evil, Russia, China, and the Islamic Republic in Iran, will explore military, economic, and technological cooperation that bolsters Khamenei's regime and its religious regional ambitions. Joining us for this panel are Gabriel Noronha, fellow at GINSA and executive director at Polaris National Security, Carrie Filipetti, executive director at the Vandenberg Coalition, and Danielle Pletka, distinguished senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. The panel is moderated by Andrew Ghalili, Nufti's senior policy analyst.
Thank you all for joining us for this awesome panel. As Mina noted, we will be talking about the new axis of evil, the growing alliance between Iran, Russia, and China. To start off, we will focus on economic cooperation, a little bit of a focus on China. Gabriel, we can start with you. So China is the regime in Iran's largest trading partner. About 70% of Chinese exports to Iran are either vehicles, machinery, nuclear reactors, or electronics. China makes up 15% of Iran's $65 billion in exports. But Iran only makes up 0.3% of China's exports. How important is this relationship economically, both to Iran and to China, and what strategic advantages, if any, does it provide to China?
Well, I think it's pretty clear now that if the People's Republic of China had not stepped in 2019 to provide an economic lifeline to the Islamic Republic would no longer be here today. And that is a function primarily of the only real economic relationship that matters here, which is the oil trade. Roughly $30 billion a year, maybe 25 to 30 billion in oil trade that Iran sells to China. But if you're China, for your point, Iran is just a speck out there. Iran is number 50 on China's list of top trading partners versus Iran. For Iran, China is number 1. And so there's a question of, is there a strategic imbalance there? Is there a child-parent relationship? And we talk a lot about how Iran has all these proxies and almost vassals in the region. And the question is, for the Iranian decision makers, do they actually worry about being the vassal and the lesser partner with China? And I think there's a lot of consternation there. They've been a lot back, especially 2019, 2020. There were concerns that China was trying to buy up land and oil energy rights from China in Iran, and the parliamentarians actually tried to expel the Chinese ambassador over that deep insecurity. But then I think it's important for us to not overstate this economic relationship. Back in 2008, China had next to zero foreign direct investment stock in Iran. That rose in 2015 very rapidly up to about $3.5 billion. But for the last 10 years, it stayed almost exactly the same there at $3.5 billion. So in 2019, there was this much vaunted announcement about a $400 billion treaty between Iran and China. There's no basis for that number to ever become reality. If the FDI stock stays at $3.5 billion over the next 20 years, which it is going that way, once you actually account for inflation, the whole thing is going down. Iran has nothing to offer China except its natural resources. And for China, it's simply a question of how much of a nuisance is this going to be worth. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities, which we'll discuss later, about how can the United States actually take advantage of this imbalance and try to use that as a wedge to weaken the Islamic Republic. But what's important to note is don't overstate how important Iran is to China. And that's a blessing, a true blessing for us.
Thank you, Gabriel. Continuing on that, Danielle, the Islamic Republic's 25-year cooperation agreement with China covers economic, military, cultural exchanges. What do you see as the long-term implications on Iran's development specifically and its ambitions on the region?
Look, I see this, by the way, thank you, everybody, for having me. I see this exactly the same way Gabriel does, and I think there's a tendency on the part of analysts to overread the importance of this. China, first of all, China prioritizes diversification. So they're not going to put their eggs in any one Middle Eastern basket. They've got very substantial investments in Israel, for example, and have been buying up the self-same oil fields, little companies inside Iraq. So, you know, I think that the bigger concern is really what we're going to dive into in a minute, which is the meat of this relationship and this axis between Russia, China, and Iran. I don't see, so the Chinese have had a nefarious role in Iran for many years. They've supported the Islamic Republic's WMD programs, but again, never, you know, it's never been a big thing for them. You know, they're helpful, but when the United States periodically goes over and yells at them about it, hey, stop helping them with their missile program, hey, stop helping them with their nuclear program, they're like, oh yeah, oh okay, and they kind of let up for a hot minute, and then they start up again. But it's not critical. It's just a pawn in their pieces. But I think the even more important thing to say is that while the Iranians have an incentive to suggest that this deal that was done in 2019 was a big BFD, the reality is that that prism is solely the Iranians' prism and not the Chinese. And even more importantly, if, when push comes to shove, Iran becomes involved in some kind of conflict, will they be able to look to the Chinese to help them? I mean, maybe at the Security Council, but otherwise, absolutely not.
Thank you. One more on this topic. To counter the effect of U.S. sanctions, the regime in Iran has sought to strengthen its economic ties with China. How effective has this partnership been in shielding the Islamic Republic from U.S. sanctions? And what can we do to undermine this economic resilience?
So I remember in 2019 at the State Department, we were trying to take Iran's oil exports legally down to zero. And so at the start of 2019, there were 5 nations that were importing Iranian oil. We ended the waivers for those, including for China. And for a few months, Iran was exporting just about no oil legally. And then China started popping up these little teapot refineries, and the ghost armada started taking more and more oil. We started sanctioning these entities, but the Chinese had a very sophisticated plan orchestrated by CCP leadership to build sanctions-proof entities, basically entities that did not exist anywhere on the system except ultimately tied up to the People's Bank of China. And the gambit was pretty clear. Normally, U.S. sanctions provide this dilemma. Will you do business with the United States, or will you do business with Iran? You can't do both. And these special proof entities said, that's an easy decision for us. We're only connected to the People's Bank of China. You can't sanction us without sanctioning the People's Bank of China. And they called their bluff, and quite successfully so. So now Iran is exporting between 1.2 and 1.8 million barrels of oil per day to China. And the question is, can we solve that through sanctions? Unfortunately, the answer is effectively no. They called our bluff on it. But sanctions are just one small tool in that toolbox. And I think what's very important, Senator Graham put out a proposal a few months ago where he said he had talked to President Trump, and there was a idea of using tariffs that would be tied specifically to this export of Iranian oil to foreign countries. That if any country was found to be importing Iranian oil, all their goods and services would be tariffed. I think he used 300 or 500%, which is perhaps a little higher than might actually happen. But again, how do you impose this conundrum on the Chinese Communist Party to make that choice not worth it? So the U.S. does roughly in the range of $800 billion trade a year with China. The EU does about the same. And so we talk about, if you're the Chinese government, are you willing to jeopardize your trade relationship writ large over this tiny $30 billion pile? And that's a real opportunity. The other issue is Iran is only the number 6th largest oil exporter to China. You look at Saudi Arabia, Oman, Iraq, and a couple others, Russia. those are more important to China. And so they have many ways to actually diversify off of that Iranian oil. And the question is, what leverage, independent of these individual little specs, can we use to harness to try to change that relationship? Now, the question for whoever wins in November is, let's build all this leverage against the Chinese Communist Party. But do we really want to use it on Iran, or do we want to use it over Taiwan issues? Do we want to use it over intellectual property issues, the trade imbalance? That's where it gets a really hard decision of saying we have a lot of competing goals against the Chinese Communist Party. It's the #1 geopolitical relationship. How much of that leverage do we want to extract over this, might call it an irritant, but then as we're approaching, okay, do we have to deal with a nuclear armed Iran? That is going to elevate Iran higher and higher on that equation. From personal observation, one of the, I think, shortcomings, this is probably of every executive branch, but just personally in the last administration, was the issue of personnel siloing, that you have your Iran team here, you have your China team there. And they don't talk very often just because you're so enmeshed. And so it becomes hard for these interagency groups to go across government. I think that needs to change, and one of the good advantages about this new axis of evil is it's forced policymakers to go across silos and solve these problems in an interdisciplinary, interdepartmental way. And this is totally with Russia, which we'll talk about next. But forcing ourselves to impose conundrums on the sets of relationships as a top priority.
Thank you. Danielle, did you want to? So we'll move on to military cooperation. Carrie, Iran, Russia, China have increasingly deepened their military cooperation through things like joint military exercises. How does this growing military cooperation change the strategic calculations for the United States and its allies specifically?
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to answer it sort of in three ways. One is how they describe this relationship in their own words. The second is what that military cooperation actually looks like, and then third and finally what this means for us and what we can potentially do about it. In terms of how they describe this relationship, in 2022, as many of you probably already know, the spokesperson for the National Security and Foreign Policy Committee of the regime's parliament essentially described this trilateral relationship between China, Russia, and Iran as built specifically to end the, quote, inequitable hegemony of the United States and of the West. And so they view this as, again, in their own words, a new world order. And I think that's critically important that we understand their purpose for this engagement. So we'll probably speak about, there are a lot of spoilers in that relationship, which are things that we might potentially consider exacerbating the lack of dependence that China has on Iran being, of course, among them. In terms of what we're actually seeing, I would describe the military cooperation as a combination of direct military and defense relationship, which we see more in the space of the Iranian-Russian relationship, and then the what I would call dual-use space, which is where we see China's involvement. And also I would say China's involvement is more security necessarily than specifically military or defense. So what I mean by that is, as has been in the news quite a lot recently, we have seen how Iran is providing equipment, a lot of military equipment to the Russian regime in their efforts against Ukraine. We have seen it from thousands of drones that have been sent over to the recent announcement of close-range ballistic missiles that have been sent. We have also seen artillery, mortar shells, all of the sort of gamut of things. Russia, it's in sort of what they're providing to the Iranian regime, they are basically taking equipment from the battlefield, Western equipment, allowing the Iranian regime to essentially reverse engineer that equipment to understand how Western equipment operates. We've seen them providing GPS denial systems and jamming systems. We've seen aid to their space program, and we have also seen a lot of nuclear cooperation as well. China's piece is a little bit different here. I do not see that China will provide direct military equipment to the Iranian regime. Where I do see them heavily involved, particularly as it relates to the military, is with surveillance equipment. So as many of you are likely aware, During the protests in which Mahsa Amini was murdered by the regime, a lot of that equipment that was identifying who are the women that should be targeted by the regime was provided by Chinese technology. We also saw last month a report that there is an increased desire by the Iranian regime to engage with 2 Chinese satellite companies. If they were able to do that, this would be incredibly significant for the United States for a few reasons. One of those Chinese satellite companies also had an arrangement with the Wagner forces in 2022, providing surveillance equipment for them to use in their operations against Ukraine. Also because the equipment that would be provided by these Chinese companies is vastly superior to what Iran currently possesses. So they can get a resolution as fine as 1 centimeter. So this is extremely advanced equipment. It's essentially equivalent to what the United States and Europe is capable of as well. You can only imagine what that would mean in terms of their ability to more specifically target the United States, to target Israel, to target our allies and our assets in the region. So in terms of what we can do about it, I do think this thing that was brought up by both Gabe and Danny about understanding that China is not dependent on Iran is a key area that we can try to exploit to try to make the costs to China high enough such that they would not want to engage in this, that they would not put themselves on the line in this way. So again, looking at those potential spoilers, and there's a lot of them, are ways to try to reduce this cooperation. But as it stands, they are very committed to this partnership, not because they agree on everything, but because they agree that the United States and the American-led system should not be the defining system for our global order.
Thank you, Carrie. Gabriel, I want to continue on something Carrie touched on, which was Russia has supplied Iran with advanced military technology. We're now seeing reports that Iran is supplying ballistic missiles to Iran in exchange for nuclear knowledge. Can you delve a little bit into the security risks this poses and how this might alter the military balance in the region, specifically with key actors like Israel, Saudi Arabia?
So we now have confirmation from US and European, and I think an Israeli intelligence, that Iran has provided these Fath, I think 360 missiles to Russia. Interestingly, that choice to provide these short-range missiles technically does not violate the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, because that prohibition is for long-range missiles that are deemed capable of delivering a nuclear payload. So it is still escalatory, massively escalatory, to be using Iranian weapons to slaughter Ukrainian civilians, destroy Ukrainian infrastructure. And Europe really has an imposition now to act. They've done, the E3, UK, France, Germany, have banned Iran Air or announced that they're banning Iran Air, which is a very important first step. But I think what's important here is also the Russian side. This transfer of nuclear, we're not sure if it's material, if it's technology or know-how, is in violation of that UN resolution. And that resolution, that nuclear prohibition, expires next October, so 13 months from now. We don't know the extent of this. I think Iran on its own was probably capable of taking the steps to go to a nuclear breakout if it wants to, hasn't chosen to do so yet. The question is, that's an incredibly escalatory act that has gotten almost no attention in the Western press. And to my knowledge, there's been zero political or other repercussion imposed by the United States, imposed by the European Union on this act, which should concern us. There's a key company that everyone should know the name of, which is almost certainly involved in this, and that's Rosatom. It's the Russian state-owned nuclear enterprise. It was the 7th largest company in Russia before the Ukraine war. They've been involved in the takeover of Chernobyl, of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. They've been involved in production of missiles, and now they're involved, likely, in helping Iran's nuclear program. The key here is, if you're an Arab government, you should be penalizing Russia for this too, and you should be penalizing Rosatom. There are a number of Middle Eastern governments, Egypt, for example, Turkey, who do business with Russia and with Rosatom. We need to be marshaling a diplomatic plan here and saying, if you are a country that does not want to see Iran get a nuclear weapon, you might not hate them, but you don't like them and you don't want one of your neighbors to have one, you need to be going and talking to Russia. I don't see us having a diplomatic outreach campaign on this. for every single little escalatory act, we need to be going and marshaling support from a wide range of partners and saying, if you have issues with this, make it known. Provide a deterrent response. And so there's other things I think we should be creative on this front. If Russia is going to send nuclear technology to one of our adversaries, I know of some countries in East Asia who are friendly to us that have been talking about nuclear weapons for a long time. There are interesting things that can be done to balance the playing field and make Russia back down at a minimum from this.
Thank you, Gabriel. Danielle, I think if we can touch on quickly something related to this that maybe a lot of people haven't heard about, which is Russia selling missiles to the Houthis. Can you talk about what's different about that, why that's starting to happen now, and why that could be potentially so important?
So I think what's interesting, and I think because we started off on China, we in some ways misled you. China obviously is the big kahuna economically, militarily, but China's focus is in East Asia and Southeast Asia. It's not interested in the problems of the Middle East, if you know what I mean. Yeah. You know, unlike the Russians, who I think are. You know, the fatal mistake, and we can probably pinpoint any number of them, but the fatal mistake happened in the Obama administration, when John Kerry basically went and handed Syria over to the Russians in order to avoid the president having to act on his threatened red line, right? So, the Russians are going to come in, they're going to take the chemical weapons away from Syria. They didn't do that, but they now have 2 bases in Syria. Now, this is the first time since the end of the Cold War that the Russians have a base on the Mediterranean. That's really important. Now, again, why does that matter vis-a-vis these conflicts? Right now, Russia's distracted in Ukraine, but that's not going to continue forever. And I mean, both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris have made clear that they're going to look for some sort of a solution to this early in their administrations. So we'll see what happens. But at that point, Russia will be free to refocus. At the same time, what they've done is something that they did during the Cold War, right? Which is start to sort of pick off various pieces of opportunity, right? So they're in tight with obviously with the Libyans, certain sectors. They're in tight with the Egyptians, and in fact, I think lots of naughty behavior going on there. And now they are trying to sell missiles to, sell is probably a loose term, provide, let's say, longer range missiles to the Houthis. We saw this during the Cold War when we saw these weird nexuses of groups coming together. So, you know, you'd see the PLO and the African National Congress and the Irish Republican Army all working together, training in some third country, right? And it was like, these guys have absolutely no interest in each other, but they are the resistance, right? So in the intersectionality, if I may use that expression, of Russian foreign policy, it is basically, okay, we're with the Iranians. The Iranians are sticking it to the Americans. Therefore, we are going to help the people who the Iranians are helping. Now, that is a problem. So far, what we have seen is that the Russians have not interfered with Israeli operations over Syria. So, for example, when the Israelis retaliated against the April strike, if I can call it that, failed Iranian strike on Israel, they did so over Syrian territory. And the Russians, the Syrians never do anything, but, you know, I'll shoot that down later. But the Russians did nothing either. And that all could begin to change. And that really will have dangerous, dangerous implications, because the Iranians are still limited financially, even weapons-wise, in how much they provide. And we saw this during the maximum pressure campaign. They cut very drastically the amount of money they were giving to Hezbollah, right? And so we could potentially see a very different future rising out of this if the Russians choose to begin to back the groups that are being backed by the Iranians, because they have no damn interest in Yemen. Au contraire, right? This is something where, as you say, the region weirdly has all of these interests, but Saudi Arabia, as best I can tell, has not gone to the Russians and said, what are you thinking here exactly? So, big problem.
If I can jump in, what, I don't know if it surprised me, but what was telling was right after October 7th, Moscow inviting Hamas leadership in to go visit there. I've heard, I don't think we haven't seen reporting yet, but I've heard that there's going to be increased Russian cooperation to Hamas and Hezbollah. And then the Chinese turn against Israel. I remember a lot of us went to Israel and would say, guys, please stop please stop having the Chinese be your port operators, please stop doing this. And they would say, we have to balance. And then the Chinese just went and turned right on them right after October 7th. And some of us may have said, we told you so, but not in any positive sense, but sort of saying they have made their bed with their access. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is only going to increase, per Danny's point.
Absolutely true, and I think that leads into where we're heading now, which is more of the diplomatic and propaganda campaigns this new axis of evil has taken up. Both Russia and China have supported Iran, the Islamic Republic, in the international forums like the UN. Carrie, how does this diplomatic backing help the regime resist international pressure, and what does it mean for global governance?
Yeah, well, and that final question of what it means for global governance is very important, because ultimately the UN could be a useful player in theory, and was, right? The passing of Resolution 2231 was a critically important component that allowed any country that was involved in the United Nations to be able to ensure that Iran was not violating that resolution. And it gave us a lot of power and credibility that we wouldn't otherwise have. So there's a utility to organizations like the United Nations, but the reason why it is no longer effective in countering Iran is, I would say, twofold. One is the increase in the relationship between these three nations, and as Danny mentioned, the decision for Russia to engage in Syria, as well as the decision for the United States to allow our red lines to basically expire without holding anybody accountable, was a key factor here in Russia's increased relationship with the Iranian regime. But there's also China's increased relationship and integration within the United Nations system. And that is actually a very new phenomenon that people are not paying enough attention to. So for many, many decades, China essentially said that the United Nations is an aspect of the American-led system, what other people refer to as the liberal rules-based international order. And as a result, they didn't want to participate in it because they thought doing so would give a huge amount of credibility to the United States and our allies. She made a strategic calculation that rather than avoid the United Nations system, they could try to co-opt it and move it towards their purposes, which are essentially to undermine the United States and reorient everything towards Beijing. That decision has been implemented, and now in 2022, she referred to the multilateral system as core to their national security and foreign policy priorities. So what that has meant is this increased investment of China into the UN system through both personnel, where we saw an 85% increase in Chinese nationals leading entities within the United Nations, to also funding, where the United States remains the largest funder, but now China is the second largest and much more strategic in how it leverages its funding to try to accomplish its international objectives. And we see the direct results of that, not just as it relates to Iran. The results of that as it relates to what we all went through from 2020 until basically today with respect to COVID, right? That was Chinese manipulation of the international system through the WHO, which they were only able to do because of this takeover that she started to implement. So we've seen it in that context. We also see it in the context of language of resolutions. When I was at the United Nations, we were constantly fighting China and Russia in trying to amend languages to focus on the wrong issue. A perfect example of this is resolutions in the Security Council that are meant to counter Russian aggression in Ukraine. China always amends them so that they talk more about American sanctions that are hindering food security around the world, right? So they use this power very strategically. So the diplomatic backing is, I think, not only core to protecting the Islamic Republic of Iran, but also a key component in the antagonism and anti-Americanism that is being perpetuated by this entire strategic alliance.
So I want to underscore something based on what Carrie just said. You know, all these efforts, this has been a thread which I think the Chinese kind of doubled down on, but it's always been an element of both Russian and Chinese foreign policy to try to shift the world's focus from a U.S.-led international order to a non-aligned, or whatever word you want, the Group of 77, whatever it is, order. Those efforts almost never succeed. Okay? So you talk about, we were just chatting in the green room before, right? The Belt and Road Initiative. Talk about the effort to move away from a dollar-based global economy, right? To have a yuan-based one, to have a special drawing rights, IMF-based one, maybe the euro, maybe something else. All of these efforts have fallen incredibly flat. They've never come to fruition in the way that sort of alarmists here in the United States have suggested that they might. But that is not a compliment, right? They only have done that because of the incompetence of the people involved, right? The Chinese and the Russians are not good at this. And failed to bring along other successful countries for obvious reasons. The only reason they've had even the most minimal success, and I would especially underscore what Carrie described very correctly as a truly insidious and dangerous Chinese effort to infiltrate UN agencies that we've never heard of and never want to think about and don't care about at all. But they dominate regulatory agencies, they dominate aviation, for example, they dominate communications, all of these kinds of things. But the reason that has happened is because we have let it happen, right? That we don't have a policy, and it is in each case, if we made an even minimal effort to stand up a coherent, all hands on deck, per your silo issue, approach to this, right? They wouldn't even have the minimal success that they have right now.
Yeah, this is, I will foot stomp Danny's foot stomping of this, because I think it's really true. I mean, in the Trump administration, and at this point, I apologize that I can't remember the specific organization within the UN, because there are so many, and we fought China on every single one of them. But there was a moment where there was a Chinese national who we knew was affiliated with the CCP who was running to try, I think it was maybe the ITU.
ICAO.
Oh, no, it wasn't ICAO, it was the ITU, where they were running to try to be the Director General of the ITU. Our Ambassador Bremberg, who was our representative, told the State Department, we have got to fight this tooth and nail. The State Department said, it's going to happen. There's no way that we can stop it. We have to just let it go. And Ambassador Bremberg, to his credit, said, I think maybe we should try. Just let's try. And we won, and we were able to stop it. And so we do need to put in the effort, and the best example of how we can do that as it relates to Iran right now is 2231 and making sure that the E3 implements snapback. And I know that's something that we'll chat a lot about, and Gabe has been a huge advocate of this, but we have essentially a year and a few days to make sure that they implement snapback. Otherwise, we lose all of the existing opportunities that we have to ensure that Iran is held accountable and is not able to access a nuclear weapon. And so that is a key thing. That is just on us and the E3 to make sure that that happens. And the fact that it hasn't yet, despite their advancement in their nuclear program, despite their giving weapons to the Russians, is, I think, a huge stain on the West.
Yeah, on snapback briefly, because I was going to address it at the end. We have 392 or 393 days before not only do the nuclear restrictions expire, the ability to ever again have international sanctions on Iran expires permanently. There will be no point in the future where Russia and China agree to put sanctions back on Iran. Maybe a century from now, we'll see. But if we fail here, Actually, the only silver lining is that it will put the death knell to the relevance of the United Nations, which is indeed a silver lining. But it will, I think, be the death knell of the relevance of the body entirely. We actually don't even have this long. The process to then actually initiate snapback takes 35 days, 65 if you want to go through what I call the marriage counseling process to facilitate the divorce. And so we're talking August at latest. But if we take it to that end, we are asking for a disaster. We are asking for the Iranians to put all sorts of pressure on the Europeans. We are asking for them suddenly to have a charm offensive right beforehand and say, oh, please, we're actually going to end our nuclear program if you just don't do this. And so this is something that has to happen in the next few months, or we are putting ourselves in a very, very dangerous position to allow the legal importation and export of nuclear materials, ballistic missiles, tanks, planes, anything you can imagine to and from Iran across the world. We don't want to see that happen.
Thank you. One last topic I want to ask about before some closing remarks. The disinformation campaigns coming from the Islamic Republic are in the news a lot lately, but from the Islamic Republic, Russia, and China, they all have kind of the same goal. It's mutually reinforcing anti-American propaganda. How are these regimes using the disinformation? What have we seen? And what role does the Islamic Republic play in projecting power beyond the Middle East even? Sorry, for Carrie and anyone before these closing remarks, please jump in.
Yeah, so the disinformation question always reminds me of a quote that my mom used to always say. It's a G.K. Chesterton quote. And it's something, to paraphrase it, something along the lines of, you should be open-minded, but not so open-minded that your brains fall out. And the reason I mention this is because what we're seeing is a concerted effort by Russia, China, and Iran to take advantage of the openness of the American system through freedom of press, through the multilateral system, all of these entities that were meant to protect and preserve those liberal values. They are capitalizing off of that and taking advantage. And so what we're seeing in terms of disinformation, just to give you a couple of numbers, and of course this is the best estimates from the United States, the numbers may be significantly higher than this, but the estimates are essentially that Russia spends about $1.5 billion a year on disinformation. China spends about $7 billion a year on disinformation. Iran, it's in the hundreds of millions. They obviously are much more constrained economically. But what does the United States do to address it? Well, we basically have one entity, which is the Global Engagement Center, the GEC, which now it has a budget of, I think, $61 million. And it's been the target of Russian disinformation to try to connect it to the CIA and basically get all the Republicans to stop funding it, right? So we're spending $61 million in contrast to billions of dollars being spent by our adversaries in spreading disinformation. It's about both the financing of specific bodies within the United States and elsewhere. So for example, the CCP has a propagandist that's very directly involved in a lot of organizations that you have probably seen protesting at your events. Organizations like Code Pink, for example, is funded by a CCP propagandist. I actually believe one of the co-founders is married to that CCP propagandist. And you see them all the time, probably protesting at Nufti events. My chairman, Elliot Abrams, gets protested constantly by them. And the reason is to connect back to what you just said, which is their objective is to foment insecurity and a lack of social cohesion in the United States. So they're funding these bodies that are spreading anti-American sentiment. They're funding bodies that are spreading anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Semitism. They are helping to actively organize those entities as well, so not just giving funding, but really directly helping them with tactics. And Iran is also funding, and this is particularly true in the Western Hemisphere, a lot of Spanish language media that is promoting pro-Hezbollah and pro-regime propaganda to the very large expat population of Palestinians and Lebanese that are south of our border. So they are taking advantage of that population, attempting to not only finance Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies, but recruit for potential terrorists. And they do this through their Spanish language media. They do it through cultural centers that are established all throughout the region. And not just, by the way, Latin America, that's more my area, but all around the world. And so this is a key part of their strategy. And of course, with the rise and advancement of social media, specifically TikTok, again, another outlet for CCP propaganda, you can see how this is all connected. They are being even more effective in converting people around the world to this pro-Islamist, pro-Iranian regime ideology.
Quick show of hands. Who knows what IRIB is? Most folks. It's the Islamic Republic International Broadcasting. Under maximum pressure, they had to close 3 of their whole language programs in foreign languages because they ran out of cash. They're back now.
Thank you. That's a good final point before this last question on which can be taken as just closing remarks. But I just to give some hope and some sort of plan. What resources does the United States have to counter this emerging new axis of evil? And if you have a top 3 recommendations, what are your top 3 recommendations for countering this? We can go down the aisle if you'd like, or just closing remarks again, please.
Top 3 recommendations, huh? There aren't 3, is the problem. We need to recognize that we are really on the cusp of Iranian nuclear weapons breakout or Iranian nuclear breakout capability, right? Where it is just a question of it being up to them to do something. If you talk to 2 good friends of mine who represent European countries in Iran, they agree. Europe has no Iran policy. We have imposed very few sanctions on additional sanctions under the Biden administration. Europe has no Iran policy. America has no Iran policy. Having a policy is a strong recommendation. Further, Carrie mentioned TikTok, and I think it's really important. Look, we're an audience that's preaching to the choir, right? You all are interested in this organization, so you are a natural person to listen to us. The problem for us is that 30% of Gen Zers get all of their news from TikTok, right? TikTok is rabidly pro-Iran, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, pro-Russia, and so, again, you cannot solve this as an Iran problem. And just because we've been talking about this, but again, hugely important, we really do need to dismantle the architecture of international organizations that exist to facilitate the domination of the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, as opposed to anything else. We pay more than any other country, including China, for every single one of these organizations. And when you see the UN doing nothing, the ICC doing nothing, the Human Rights Council doing nothing, the World Health Organization doing nothing, this is where Congress actually will be responsive. It's not just having a foreign policy, it's using the tools available to us effectively.
I think you might have gotten 3 there. We have about 3 more minutes, but we can let them wait for lunch, so please feel free to.
I'll do 3. The United States and the international community can and should bankrupt Iran Air and other regime airlines. The United States and the international community can and should bankrupt Rosatom, which is funneling weapons and nuclear know-how across the region. And the United States and the international community can and should bankrupt every single Chinese entity that is connected to the oil trade with the Islamic Republic of Iran.
So I think there have been a lot of recommendations, Gabe, and by the way, if you have not, Gabe is constantly testifying in front of Congress and has laid out probably hundreds of recommendations to add to those as well, so I highly recommend people read it. I think the biggest thing for me is that we recognize a couple of things. So the first thing is we need to recognize that the fight of the Iranian people is the fight of the United States. This is about morality, this is about freedom, and this is about civilization. And the problem is the United States, and Danny raised this, the United States and our European allies have failed to understand exactly what is at stake for all of us. We have viewed Iran as a Middle Eastern problem, and it's not. This is a problem for Western civilization, and if we fail to deter the Iranian regime, particularly given its alliance with Russia and China, we will quickly see the fall of other pro-freedom countries around the world. And so there is so much at stake here. We need leaders in the United States and leaders around the world that are willing to stand up for and defend our principles and not allow them to continue to get co-opted by these three malign actors.
I guess I'm not sure if we have questions from the audience, but if not, that will be the end of our panel here. So I guess it has to be submitted again. The questions need to be the questions need to be submitted through the QR code, and then.
We'll ask one or two before lunch.
Okay.
This first question is to any of the panelists. The American public seems to understand the threat from China and Russia, but why do the American public and the media seem so disconnected from reality when it comes to the threat of the regime and when it comes to how opposed Iranians are to it?
I've always believed that the Islamic Republic's greatest successes, to quote a line from Kevin Spacey, I'm blanking. It's from The Usual Suspects. It's the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. I think what we just saw in New York over the past week is one of the most shameful things. Western media and mostly American reporters lining up to interview Javad Zarif and President Pezeshkian and asking them the most softball questions that you can imagine. That says it all. They have sorely, sorely failed at their job to confront dictators and apologists, if talking to them at all. I will say, I've looked at the polling on this for the last 6 years. 6 years ago, if you polled the American public and you asked them about the threat from the Islamic Republic, it was middling. The data has actually shown over the last 6 years a significant improvement in the number of Americans who understand the threat, who actually believe that this is one of the most significant problems, and actually say that it has been one of the greatest failings of the last 3.5 years of the United States Iran policy to not confront that. So sometimes we get a little depressed here, but when I actually look at the data, I think the public has actually recognized over the last few years in a way that it didn't in, say, 2015, 2016, the true threat from the Islamic Republic.